sometimes a shift in a relationship comes from something people don't even realize they're doing. And I want to stay right there for a moment because that matters. People usually think relationship shifts come from something obvious: a big argument, a betrayal, a dramatic change, a moment you can point to and say, that right there is when everything changed. But a lot of times, that is not how it happens. Sometimes it happens quietly. Sometimes it happens through something that looks harmless on the outside. Something that does not feel dangerous at first. Something that may not even look wrong. And that is why people miss it. Because when something doesn't look wrong, people usually don't stop and question it. They just keep moving. And sometimes what starts the shift is not physical, not obvious, not something people would immediately call inappropriate. It can start with something much quieter than that, a connection somewhere else. And let me slow this down, because this is where people can misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not talking about something that always starts with bad intentions. I'm not talking about something that always begins with somebody trying to be disloyal. A lot of times, it starts in a way that feels small. Familiar conversation, easy interaction, shared space, daily contact, a person you talk to often, a person who feels easy to talk to, a person who becomes part of your regular emotional environment. And because it feels easy, and because it feels natural, and because nothing dramatic is happening, you don't always recognize that something is being built. That is what makes this so easy to miss, because people usually pay attention to what looks physical, what looks obvious, what can be easily explained. But they don't always pay attention to emotional space. And emotional space matters more than people realize. Because relationships are not only shaped by what people do physically, they are shaped by where people go emotionally too. They are shaped by familiarity, by comfort, by where somebody begins to feel understood, by where somebody begins to feel seen, by where somebody begins to relax emotionally. And none of that always looks dangerous in the beginning. That is why a person can be in the middle of it and not even realize the shift has already started, because it still feels innocent, still feels manageable, still feels like normal conversation, still feels like nothing to worry about. And sometimes that is exactly how the shift enters. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, through what feels harmless, through what feels familiar, through what keeps happening, until it starts taking up more room than anybody realized. And that is the beginning people often miss. Not because they are stupid, not because they do not care about their relationship, but because people do not always understand that emotional connection is still connection, and emotional space is still space. And where that space starts getting filled matters. But here's the part most people don't realize. And over time, that connection becomes normal, comfortable, something you do not think twice about. And that is where the real shift begins. Because repetition makes things feel safe. What happens regularly starts to feel natural. What you return to often starts to feel familiar. And familiarity has power. And this is where it quietly crosses a line without feeling like it crossed anything at all. Because once something becomes familiar, you stop examining it the same way. You stop questioning it the same way. You stop noticing the emotional effect of it the same way. Now it just feels like part of life, part of the routine, part of the day, part of the environment. And this is where people get caught off guard, because nothing dramatic had to happen for the dynamic to deepen. It deepened through repetition, through daily interaction, through consistency, through the comfort of knowing how that conversation feels, the comfort of knowing how that person responds, the comfort of knowing what kind of emotional tone lives there. And I want to stay there for a moment because this is important. People often underestimate how much comfort matters. Not just attraction, not just desire, comfort. Because comfort is where emotional attachment can quietly grow. When something feels easy, people return to it. When something feels light, people relax into it. When something feels like relief, people don't always stop to ask why it feels that way. And sometimes that is how emotional space starts shifting. Not because someone sat down and decided, I'm going to replace something in my relationship. No. Sometimes it happens because another space started feeling easier, smoother, less demanding, less loaded, less complicated. And if someone is not paying attention, they can start leaning there emotionally without even noticing they are leaning. That is what makes this so subtle, because the person may still love their spouse, still go home, still do life, still believe they are committed, still believe nothing major is wrong. And yet, something emotional has started moving. Something has started settling somewhere else. Not fully, not always dramatically, but enough to create a difference. And once that difference starts growing, the relationship begins to feel it. Because whatever gets your emotional softness, your easiest openness, your relaxed conversation, your repeated internal access is taking up room. And room matters, because emotional energy is not endless. Attention is not endless. Softness is not endless. The part of you that feels open, that feels seen, that feels emotionally engaged, that part matters. And where it goes matters. Because if that part of you is getting activated somewhere else regularly, something inside the relationship can start feeling different, even if nobody has language for it yet, even if nobody has admitted it yet, even if nobody has done anything that sounds dramatic enough to raise alarm. The shift can still be real because emotional comfort has a way of deepening quietly. And by the time somebody notices the relationship feels different, the pattern may already be established. Now there is less openness at home, less attentiveness at home, less ease at home, less softness at home. Not necessarily because somebody is being cruel, but because emotional energy has already started forming another rhythm somewhere else. And rhythms matter because what becomes regular starts shaping the heart without asking permission. Now, this is where it starts affecting the relationship, even if nobody has said it out loud yet. But what people don't always realize is emotional space is still space. And I want to sit here for a moment because this is the part people often skip over. They think, well, nothing happened. It's just conversation. It's just talking. It's just someone I'm around. It's just someone who understands me. And that right there is where people can miss the seriousness of what is happening. Because emotional closeness does not stop being meaningful just because it is not physical. It is still meaningful. It is still intimate in its own way. It is still shaping something because intimacy is not only physical access. Sometimes intimacy is emotional access. Who gets your inner world? Who gets your relaxed thoughts? Who gets your unguarded responses? Who gets the version of you that is softer, lighter, more open, more easily reached? That matters. And I am not saying that every outside conversation is automatically wrong. That is not what I am saying. People have coworkers, friends, communities, regular interactions. That is life. But the issue is not simply that interaction exists. The issue is when emotional room starts getting occupied in a way that changes the feeling inside the relationship. That is the part. When emotional space starts being filled somewhere else, something inside the relationship can start feeling different. Not always because the spouse can clearly explain it. Not always because there is proof of anything obvious, but because relationships feel shifts before they always understand them. One person may start sensing distance, a difference in tone, a difference in attentiveness, a difference in openness, a difference in the way conversation feels. a difference in what is shared and what is held back. And the other person may not even fully understand why that is happening, because from their perspective, nothing is wrong. Nothing physical happened. Nothing dramatic happened. So they may not see the emotional movement for what it is. But emotional movement is still movement. And people can feel when something has moved. They can feel when the warmth is different. They can feel when the energy is different. They can feel when something that used to belong naturally inside the relationship now feels thinner, more distant, less available. And that is where confusion begins, because now one person is feeling a difference, but may not know how to name it. And the other person may be participating in a shift without realizing the impact of it. And that is what makes this hard to talk about, because nobody wants to overstate something. Nobody wants to sound accusatory. Nobody wants to make something out of nothing. But sometimes what looks like nothing on the outside is still shaping everything underneath, because emotional space is not empty. It holds familiarity. It holds comfort. It holds access. It holds emotional tone. And if another connection starts holding too much of that, the relationship feels the loss, even if nobody has fully admitted where it went. And that is why this matters, because people need to understand that a relationship is not only protected by avoiding obvious lines, it is also protected by paying attention to where emotional closeness is developing and what that closeness is slowly doing to the primary relationship. That is wisdom. That is maturity. That is not accusation. That is awareness. And awareness is what keeps quiet shifts from turning into bigger problems later. Not because someone is trying to hurt the relationship, but because something shifted without being noticed. And that line right there is where a lot of people live. Not in deliberate destruction, not in planned betrayal, but in unnoticed drift. And drift is dangerous because it does not announce itself. It happens gradually, quietly, over time. And if it goes unnoticed long enough, it starts changing how the relationship feels. Now, communication feels different. Not necessarily bad, just different. Now, presence feels different. Now, openness feels different. Now, the emotional atmosphere feels different. And when something feels different for long enough, distance starts forming. Not always because love disappeared, but because emotional energy moved. That is the part people don't always understand. Love can still be there, and a shift can still be happening. Commitment can still be there, and a shift can still be happening. Routine can still be there, and a shift can still be happening. That is why these things have to be understood early, because if they are not, people start responding to the symptoms without naming the source. One person becomes quieter, the other becomes defensive. One person feels uneasy, the other feels misunderstood. One person senses the relationship is not feeling the same, the other insists nothing is wrong. And now both people are reacting to something that was never clearly brought into the light. And that is how drift becomes distance. Because what is not understood usually does not get repaired correctly. It just keeps playing out. And over time, that can turn into disconnection. Not because one day somebody woke up and decided to disconnect, but because emotional space had already been shifting for a while, and nobody stopped it early. Nobody named it early. Nobody slowed down enough to ask, what has become too familiar outside this relationship? What space is being filled somewhere else? What feels different between us now? Because those are real questions, necessary questions, not to accuse, not to attack, but to protect what matters. Because long relationships are not only protected from obvious betrayal, they are protected by emotional awareness, by honesty, by noticing what is becoming too easy somewhere else, if it is starting to cost the relationship something at home. And that does not mean everybody is guilty of something dramatic. It means people are human. It means people can drift before they realize they are drifting. It means familiarity can feel harmless while still creating movement. And wisdom is being able to recognize that early. To say, let me pay attention to where my emotional ease is going. Let me pay attention to what has become too comfortable. Let me pay attention before something quiet becomes something painful. Because that is how relationships are protected. Not only by reacting after the damage is obvious, but by recognizing the subtle things early. Recognizing the shift while it is still small. Recognizing the drift while it can still be corrected. Recognizing that emotional space matters before the relationship starts living with the cost of it. Now, if you're listening to this, I want you to think about this for a moment. Not what looked wrong, but what started feeling easy somewhere else, and what that may have slowly changed inside your relationship. And that is how long relationships are protected.